In this lecture, we're going to pick up looking at how taxonomy has progressed since Linnaeus' time and discuss the five-kingdom classification system that is that's mostly in place today. So Linnaeus, when he was doing his work, established what is referred to as the two-kingdom classification system. So he saw only two kingdoms: the plant kingdom, kingdom plantae, and the animal kingdom, the animalia. As microorganisms were discovered, and then we began to recognize that microbes were different from plants and animals. A fellow named Ernst Haeckel, and here's Haeckel. The guy was an amazing. Sorry about that. He's an amazing artist. I've got some of his work, and it's just mind-stunningly, blowingly beautiful. But he was very interested in microbial or microscopic life, and he added a third kingdom to Linnaeus' two kingdoms, and he called it the protists, or kingdom protista, and included in it bacteria, algae, the protozoa, the fungi, and sponges, interestingly, rather than thinking of sponges as animals as we do today. Then in 1969, so Haeckel was working in the late 1800s, so we lived with a three-kingdom classification system until the 60s, when a fellow named Robert Whittaker proposed the five-kingdom system of classification. And it is still probably the most widely accepted version of things at the moment, although, as we have talked, like now you're getting sick of hearing it, I think, but as we've talked, there's been a lot of work to revise some of that. So he proposed Kingdom Monera, which were all the prokaryotes, Kingdom Protista, which would be any eukaryote that is single cellular, that has then the multicellular algae, and these organisms called slime molds, which are a little bit hard to describe, but we now generally consider slime molds to be in the fungi. But that was how he kind of put it out there. And then Kingdom Fungi, which is the unicellular yeasts, the multicellular molds, and any of the mushrooms. And then, of course, Kingdom Plantae and Kingdom Animalia. So we still stuck with this kind of Latinized version of these terms. So five-kingdom classification system has the protists, the fungi, the plantae, the animalia, and the monerans in it. And then in 1990, so relatively recently, just 27 years ago, Carl Weiss proposed a third an additional layer above the kingdom that he called domains, and he proposed three domains that are based on probable evolutionary relationships that we can see as we look at the genome. As we sequence genomes, we can see these evolutionary relationships. And so he proposed, or we now think about the domain eukarya, which is all of the eukaryotic organisms, the protists, the fungi, the plantae, and then animalia. Domain bacteria, which are all of the prokaryotic single-celled organisms, except for the ones that are in domain archaea. These are organisms that look a lot like bacteria, but they have a different genetic. They're just very different genetically from the bacteria. They were originally found in extreme environments and were assumed to be just a portion of the bacteria, but now we recognize that archaeans are found in a variety of habitats, and that they have an evolutionary origin that's different from the domain bacteria. And in fact, it's the archaeans that have the most recent common ancestor with the eukaryotic lines. So it is a common ancestor of archaea and eukaryotes that is our most close relative to prokaryotic life. So domains archaea and bacteria right now kind of subsume kingdom Monera. So all the Monerans are considered to be part of either domain bacteria or domain archaea. And I suspect that as we start lining out the different kingdoms of prokaryotes, that what we'll see is that there are multiple kingdoms, and we'll be able to separate archaea and bacteria into their own kingdoms and place them a little bit more comfortably under domains. But for the time being, we're going to have to kind of put up with a little bit of this oddness where we have domain archaea and bacteria all into, so this is domain, all feeding into kingdom Monera. So as I say, as we divide up kingdom Monera into its constituent kingdoms, I think we'll see that there will be kingdoms that are in domain bacteria and then kingdoms that are in domain archaea. And then things will be a little bit more organized. But for right now, we're dealing with a little bit of this disorganization. Went too far. So it seems like every biology textbook always puts out there this idea of the unity of life. So regardless of what kingdom or domain that any organism that we find living on the earth belongs to, there are some characteristics that are common to all living organisms. So these characteristics would have been found here in this common ancestor to all three domains of life. First is that living organisms are composed of cells, and that these cells must obtain nutrients and they must get rid of wastes. So they maintain homeostasis in some way. We see that the cell is the basic structural and functional unit of living organisms. So the cell is the place where all of the stuff happens. And that all cells have plasma membrane. They carry genetic information in their DNA. And they use ribosomes to make proteins. And that we see all the same organic molecules in cells. We see proteins and lipids, nucleic acids, and carbohydrates. And then finally, cells are capable of moving materials between the cytoplasm and the external environment in order to maintain homeostasis. So these are all characteristics that, regardless of domain, they are common characteristics to all living organisms. Okay, so let's take a look then at the kingdom Monera. Kingdom Monera is prokaryotic. That means that they lack true nuclei and any membrane-enclosed organelles. So no endoplasmic reticulum, no mitochondria, no chloroplasts, no Golgi apparatus. They're all unicellular, so no multicellular organisms in this group. They lack nuclei. Interesting. Clearly, I don't need to have that in there. And when you look at their DNA, there's very little or no protein associated with it. So eukaryotes, they have proteins associated with the DNA because the DNA is so big. We need these little spools to wrap the DNA around to organize it. We don't see those histones, those little protein spools, in prokaryotes. Within the kingdom Monera, we see the eubacteria. These are the ones that are of greatest concern to health science. So these are the pathogenic organisms by far are all eubacteria, belonging to the domain bacteria. There are cyanobacteria, also known as blue-green algae. These guys are photosynthetic. They're unicellular. Some of them are filamentous, and some as they grow in their watery environment, they may release toxins into it. So here are some cyanobacteria in a algal bloom on a lake in Iowa. Sorry about that. My pen is not working very well. This guy here is... What the heck just happened? Sorry about that. Man, I'm having problems with my computer, clearly. So that guy there is an example of a eubacteria. That's Clostridium difficile, the one that causes the intestinal illness C. diff. There's some cyanobacteria. And then there are the archaea. And they've got lots of differences between them and the eubacteria, but to highlight some of them, the cell wall construction is different, and the way that they use and make RNA is different. They use a different kind of RNA polymerase to build RNA. And amongst the archaea, we see the extremophiles, those that live in really extreme environments like hot springs or in the glacial ice or down in 5 miles deep in the ocean at deep sea vents where they're not even getting their energy from the sun because there's no sunlight down there. And as I mentioned before, it's the archaeans that are more closely related to eukaryotes than to the eubacteria. So the kingdom protista, these are eukaryotic, so that means they have true nuclei and membranous organelles inside of them. Most of the algae are unicellular, but some of them are colonial or even multicellular. So within kingdom protista, we see the algae. So here's an example of a colonial algae, Volvox. Dadgummit. I keep hitting this button. I'll have to remember that. So Volvox is a colonial bacteria that we find in fresh water, and they're super beautiful. I just love them. Then there are the protozoans. These are the animal-like protists here. We think of them as animal-like because they run around consuming food that they find. So here's a food vacuoles that have developed inside of this little protist. And then the euglenoids, which have both plant-like and animal-like characteristics. So they photosynthesize, but they also swim around very rapidly, and some of them even hunt down prey. And so here's euglena with its eye spot. So that red thing right there at the tip of that weird bubble that I was trying to make an arrow. There we are. Now it's more like an arrow. That reddish kind of spot is an organelle that it uses to locate light and orient toward light. Okay, so those are the protists. Kingdom fungi, most of them are multicellular, but there are some that are unicellular. And these guys, rather than relying on either photosynthesis or consuming food for their nutrition, instead they absorb the already digested nutrients that are, they can even produce enzymes outside their cells that they use to digest extracellularly, and then they absorb these nutrients from dead organisms. There are some that invade living tissue, but before they can do any absorbing from them, they have to kill the cells in order to get those nutrients. So a yeast infection, for instance, would be an example of a fungal infection on a human. Okay, so those are the fungi. Kingdom plantae, the plants, also eukaryotic, so nucleus and organelles, including chloroplasts in most plants. They're multicellular. Almost all of them are photosynthetic, and they use a pigment called chlorophyll to absorb light energy from the sun and then convert it into stored energy in glucose. And it turns out that they are the source of medicinal chemicals. So, for instance, there is a chemical that's used to fight breast cancer called Taxol, and it comes from the Pacific yew tree. It's an evergreen tree that's found up in the Pacific Northwest. And other medicinals like aspirin that was first used from willow bark. So willow bark has a lot of acetylsalicylic acid in it, which is the same active ingredient in an aspirin. And there's lots of microbial pathogens of plants. So we see viral as well as bacterial pathogens that will kill plants. And so we spend a lot of time, or the people who are involved in agriculture spend a lot of time thinking about and trying to resolve those issues. And then last of all in the 5-kingdom system is the kingdom Animalia that includes humans. These are eukaryotic and multicellular, so nuclei, lots of membranous organelles. They reproduce using egg and sperm to produce a zygote, and then this zygote grows up into a multicellular adult. So all animals are multicellular. Most of them are macroscopic, but there are some really interesting microscopic ones as well. And so we see lots of interest in vectors of disease, especially among microbiologists, as well as some of the microbial organisms that can attack internally, so liver flukes and tapeworms and that sort of thing. So the ones that are of most interest to microbiologists are the helminths. These are the worms. And so here are some examples of worms. This is a fluke with its suctiony cup parts and its sucking mouth parts. And this is a tapeworm. So these, you notice it also has these hook-like structures there at the head end and adhesive, suckery kind of, suction cup-looking parts. And then this is a nematode roundworm. So flukes, tapeworms, and roundworms are the 3 types of helminths that we associate with disease. And we have them both microscopic and macroscopic as parasites of humans and lots of other animals. Arthropods, they are primarily vectors of disease, although some of them, like fleas and lice, may also live directly on organisms as parasites, sucking blood or drinking other body fluids. So ticks and mites and lice and fleas and mosquitoes and flies, all of these can be vectors for disease or may be disease-causing organisms themselves, like head lice or pubic lice. So there we've got the animals. Okay, so that's everything I've got for this presentation. So just keep in mind, we've been changing our classification system over the years. First, a 2-kingdom classification system, then a 3-kingdom as protists were added to the animals and the plants, and then a 5-kingdom system with the added complexity of a domains above the kingdoms. Okay, so you know what to do if you have any questions.